Shalom and welcome to the One Pasuk podcast, where the rabbis at Congregation Avas Torah each share an insight on one particular pasuk from the Parsha and reflect on each other's ideas. Rabbinic banter, I like to call it. I am Chaim Pupko, and I am joined by my dear friends and teammates, Rabbi Daniel Goldberg
Shalom.
And Rabbi Morty Kisus.
Shalom.
If you'd like to sponsor an upcoming episode, please contact the shul. All right, here we go. Our pasuk this week comes from Bamidbar Chaf Hey Yud Gimel, chapter 25, verse 13. Pinchas, after committing his zealous act, Hashem offers him a bris shalom, a covenant of peace. And the pasuk says, "V'haisalo ulazaro acharav bris kihunas olam," and it shall be for him and his descendants after him a covenant of priesthood for all time. Tachas asher kinei lelokav, because he took impassioned action, or he did a zealous act for Hashem, v'yechaper al b'nei Yisrael, and making atonement for b'nei Yisrael.
The Or HaChaim HaKadosh addresses why it was that God himself is the one who gives the kehuna to Pinchas, and also why this was lo ulzaro aharav. What exactly was the reason as to why God decided to not only give this to Pinchas himself, but also lo ulzaro aharav. And the Or HaChaim HaKadosh beautifully addresses this, because we know that generally in life, everything is midah keneged midah. So after Pinchas performs this zealous act protecting God's honor, you would imagine it should be something very specific to that very incident itself. And clearly, what Hashem decides to give him is kehuna, priesthood, in addition to that, also to make his children and grandchildren after him. And he writes that the understanding here is when Hashem recognized that he was willing to do something for him that he didn't request, Hashem says, I'm going to do something for you that you didn't request. So I don't necessarily have to give you kehuna per se, but this is something that's very prestigious. It's a tremendous honor to be a Kohen, and therefore I am going to bestow that upon you, not by way of your father, who naturally is the way kehuna works, because as Rashi points out, Pinchas himself would not have been considered a Kohen, and therefore it was an honor that God bestows directly on Pinchas. And then additionally, lo ulazaro is a fascinating point that the Or HaChaim HaKadosh says. He says, if you think about the plague stopped, and when the plague stops, there was many, many people, families that remained intact and that eventually survived and continued. And because you caused that many Jewish families would continue, I want your kehuna to continue. And so God tells Pinchas, lo ulazaro aharav. This is something that's going to stay in your family forever, because those families that survived are going to have children, and their children will have children, and those families are going to be around forever. And because your act lives on, so too your kehuna will live on.
I think that answers a question that many ask on this whole notion of receiving a bris shalom, a covenant of peace, in reward for something which was a zealous, violent act, something which was very much not peaceful, as it were. Because the way you framed it is that his zealous, violent act ultimately was something that was productive, and it helped Jewish families, as you said. And I think that helps answer that question. Like, why would it be a bris shalom? Because he brought this sense of shalom, of completeness, peacefulness, right? That's what shalom bayis, right, to Jewish families.
That's really interesting. I'll share a little bit of like a different angle. Rav Hirsch makes an amazing connection between this episode with Pinchas and Shevet Levi more generally. You could ask, why is it that Pinchas needs the bracha of bris kehunas olam? L'chora, that should be his birthright, meaning he's the grandson of Aharon. He's the son of the Kohen Gadol, so he certainly should have been a Kohen. And so you'd have to explain that it was not necessarily going to be passed down generation to generation within Aharon's family, but after this, it solidified that it would be passed down through the bloodline to be a Kohen. So this is the act. Pinchas's act of zealotry is what solidifies that Masorah. And Rav Hirsch connects this to the Leviim, who also become the Leviim. They step into that role after the Mila Hashem Elai moment of Chet HaEgel. Moshe calls whoever's for Hashem, join me in killing the people who have done this great sin of the Chet HaEgel, and it's Shevet Levi who steps forward, this act of violence that solidifies them, holy, zealous violence for Hashem, that solidifies them as the Leviim. So it's these two acts of holy violence that solidify the Leviim, and then the Kohanim as well. And that parallel is so provocative and interesting. And I thought you could say the following. Why is it that Kohanim and Leviim, that this should be the defining moment of how they become the people that they are and their roles within the nation? If anything, it's anathema. You would think that the spiritual leaders should be people that are Ohev Shalom, Rodev Shalom. They're synonymous with peace. Why should this be that kind of defining moment that establishes them in this role? It's totally counterintuitive.
Indeed, it's Aharon himself who is characterized as the Ohev Shalom and Rodev Shalom.
Right. So one would think that the defining moment should be a demonstration that his descendants are following in that path, not the opposite. It's actually quite puzzling. So I thought maybe you could suggest as follows. There are some people who are, by their nature, just really nice, just really non-combative. They don't have a bone in their body that is zealous or it would lead them to violence. And those people are wonderful. But there's a different madrega, which are people that actually have the zealousness and can get there, but they control it. And instead they use their kochos, they channel them for the good. And I actually think maybe that's why these are the defining moments. We need to see that Levi and that the Aaron's descendants, they're not just Gutzkites so much that they just couldn't hurt a fly. No, they're people who are proud and have principles and are able to fight when things require fighting. And afal pichein, in their day-to-day interactions, they're people of peace and love. And that's something that I just thought that's something that's different. It's a different quality and a different character. It's more elevated to be a person that's not a shmata. I'm a person who's proud and has those values and has the strength to fight when I need to fight. But generally, I'm an Ohev Shalom and a Rodev Shalom, and that's why the defining moment is actually once they show that they're ready to fight when there needs to be a fight, but their default character is peaceful.
It's beautiful.
It's a beautiful idea, and I think it's really the whole premise of that great film, The Karate Kid.
Yes. That's in the footnotes of Rav Hirsch.
Yeah,
exactly. You guys know well.
Wait a second.
You guys know well.
What's the Karate Kid connection? Hold on. Let me...
The whole credo of a ninja is that you have all these capabilities. Like you could probably kill someone just by touching them on a certain part of their neck, but violence is only something you use in very extreme circumstances. You have to maintain a certain equanimity.
Right.
You guys know well that I'm not much of an expert on the film industry, but growing up, people used to tell me all the time, your dad looks just like the sensei in Karate Kid. So I'm a little bit more informed about that movie than I haven't seen it myself, I'll be honest. But
Mr. Miyagi.
I'm a little bit more,
Miyagi.
yeah. Is there something that he says
wax on, wax off, Daniel-san. People call me Daniel-san. Yeah. Right? Daniel,
right? Yeah,
Daniel-san. My siblings sometimes call me Daniel-san.
So I want to go back to that question that I mentioned before that many ask. How is it that for this zealous act of killing people, that Pinchas is rewarded with a bris shalom, a covenant of peace, a bris kehunas olam, a covenant of everlasting priesthood? Certainly the Torah doesn't shy away from acts of violence when they're necessary, but why is it celebrated in this way, especially with the concepts of shalom and kahuna? And there's one year I noticed that if you look at the broader context of the story, you see a very important point about violence and the role of violence. Because if you look at the story, Pinchas's act of violence brings an end to a magefa, brings an end to many, many deaths that were occurring because of the sinfulness and the corruption of Bnei Yisrael. And so it's not that Pinchas's act of violence is something that perpetuated violence, that began a cycle of violence, like people like to say. Just the opposite. His act of violence brought an end to death, restored a sense of shalom, a sense of peace among Bnei Yisrael. And so that's why his act is celebrated with a bris shalom and a bris kahuna, because he found the right moment, the right context in which to use an act of violence. But of course, Hashem wants us to live and thrive. Achai bohem, we always prefer life over death. But that's how I see Pinchas, and I think it's a helpful lesson. I think it's a powerful lesson for how we as Jews view violence and fighting. And I think we still carry this value very, very well in the way that we've built the state of Israel and defend ourselves against terrible, terrible enemies who seek nothing but death and destruction. We fight, and we've gotten good at fighting, and we've developed many, many technologies like the Iron Dome. But I can honestly say that we fight so that we can bring more peace, so that we can protect ourselves, so that we can live in peace with our neighbors. It's the fighting of Pinchas. It's a fighting that we have to do, that's necessary, but it's not a fighting to just continue violence and to inflict pain on others. Just the opposite. It's a violence to bring an end to violence and fighting.
What I'm hearing is that you have to look at every act, including this one with Pinchas, and including the IDF's operations wherever they are, in context.
Yeah.
Meaning, I'll kill 10 terrorists to spare 1,000 Israelis, and I think that's a very worthwhile investment, and that's what sometimes we don't necessarily appreciate about what they're trying to accomplish. And what the naysayers love to do is just highlight the violence itself at the moment that it's taking place, regardless of who's actually being killed, when the only thing that really matters is that we're killing terrorists. We're not killing innocent civilians. Of course, there's collateral damage at times, but with Pinchas, that was his goal. When we look at it in the full context, which really you highlighted so beautifully, it was an act of peace. It was violent, but it was an act of peace because ultimately there were so many Jews that remained alive on his account.
Exactly. And in a much more kind of immediate, practical sense, whenever we are taking up an issue and engaging in an argument in our own lives, I think that it's a helpful question to ask ourselves if we have the presence of mind, and it's not always possible. But number one, is this l'shem shamayim, or is this for my own ego? Certainly, the pasuk tells us Pinchas did this for Hashem, and that's an absolutely essential dimension of what he did. But also, is this something that will lead to something that's productive and that will take us closer to peace? Or is this something that will only perpetuate a cycle of anger and frustration and feelings of hurt and perpetuate argument? And again, that's a really hard calculation to make, certainly in the moment when a person is feeling that they need to kind of go down that road. But it's helpful to think about what Pinchas models for us in the kind of optimal sense.
Thank you all so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed. If you're interested in sponsoring a future episode, please reach out to one of us. And of course, please send us your feedback. Shabbat Shalom and Good Shabbos from the One Pasuk Podcast.
Hashem, Hashem, Hashem.